Welcome to another episode of Mastering Finance, the podcast. My name is Nicholas Higgs.
And I'm Jarrel.
And today we have a great topic for you. Today we'll be discussing the topic of navigating a startup to an 8-figure valuation. And today our guest is Christian Sawyer, the founder and previous president of Sunryse Shredding, rebranded as Sunryse Information Management. Thank you so much for coming today.
Pleasure to have me. Thank you. What
is Sunryse Shredding or Sunryse Information Management?
All right, good question. And first of all, thank you for having me here. I am truly honored to be here. It's definitely humbling to be here. So how do we start? In 2000, I came back from Toronto. I had an idea to meet a need that I felt was relevant here in the Bahamas, which was document and information destruction of confidential records. I saw something while I was in Toronto, developed it before, and then I came back home with that idea. Sunryse Shredding started with mobile trucks that ran around, and basically we were there to protect people's confidential information from getting in the hands of the general public. Anything from bank records to legal records, etc. Anything that they considered confidential, we just didn't want them to get into the public. And so the company was birthed with that in mind of how can we solve this problem for businesses in maintaining their private and confidential information, not just for themselves, but for their clients and their shareholders. So that's where the genesis of it. That's where we started mobile document shredding. And then obviously the company grew, expanded. We expanded our service offering, and we went from there.
And so starting in 2000, you were 28?
Yes, I was 28 years old when I first started.
And what were you doing before Sunryse?
So before Sunryse, I was living in Toronto. I was trained as a network engineer. I worked actually for Canada's second largest stock brokerage firm, and I worked in their, let's call it their IT department. And I basically put up the networks for that company. And so I spent a few years doing that. Prior to that, I was working with another company in Canada called Bell Canada, where I learned about sales. And while I was there working, I was also in school full-time. And so I've kind of been in Canada for a minute, and then I decided, hey, listen, you know what? I've gone my rounds, I've done sales, I learned about the industry, I learned some more stuff in tech, which is what I was trained in, and then I said, hey, listen, I want to come back home, start my own business. I was young, dumb, foolish, naive at the time, just recently married, and had this ostentatious belief that if I started something, it's gonna work.
Wow.
That wasn't the case. I came back and I said, oh, I'm gonna be doing all of this. And when I came back, the reality set in, and then the realization of entrepreneurship started to kick in. But it was a rough ride getting started, but certainly adapted, pivoted, and we grew the business to where we eventually exited.
So why choose to come back home to start that business?
When that's the same thing. Good question.
So I came back because basically nobody was doing it here, right? What people were doing, what I saw away, was not what was happening here in the Bahamas, and I felt as though it was just a virgin territory. That has its pros and cons. Being first to market, being able to deliver a product, or in our case, a service that was more efficient than what people were doing before, was appealing to me. Being paid US dollars, or quote unquote Bahamian dollars, versus what I'm making in Canada, and taxes, and there's no taxes, there was an advantage here. And then I think my other thing was I put a challenge out to myself, was, if I left my company, I was in tech, I was making 6 figures, I was 25, 26 at the time, and I said, hey, listen, you know what? My boss is making 6 figures, I knew what he was making, and I'm like, you know what? If I move home, how long is it gonna take for me to get to his salary? And I'm like, okay, yeah, I could do that I could do that in a short period of time, and then, I could even make much more, right? Yeah. And so there was a number of factors that led me to moving here, back home, and I was like, all right, you know what? Time for me to come home, set up roots, and then let's see what I could do. And, obviously how do I help the Bahamian economy at the same time as well.
So did you have Sunryse Shredding, the idea, ready when you came back home, or when you came over here, you saw that need then?
No, I had the idea ready before I came home. I mean, I was flying back home to do market research,
I was going to ask that too.
test the market, talk to potential clients. I went around, got letters of intent from potential clients to say, hey, listen, if this service were to come about, what do you think about it? I did, let's call it, grassroots.
Yeah.
Let's sit down and talk to people. What are you doing now? If this was to happen, do you see any benefits of it? Would you use it? What do you think your pricing would be? Do you think this is fair? We did a lot of stuff like that. And then it was obviously, going out, finding a vendor in the States. Well, I modeled it after a company in Canada, but then I found a vendor in the US that I could partner with that would provide me with the trucks and the equipment. And then it was to come back home and find funding. My dad, your parents try to assist as best as you could. Interesting story there, oh boy. But, my dad put up some collateral. I wasn't the best at business at the time. I ended up losing the collateral. These are the things people, the realities of entrepreneurship. But it was a great move. I found some funding through, initially was the Bahamas Development Bank. And we took our roads down. We did all right, and then, as we grew, we just found alternative ways to find funding to help the business grow and scale.
So to go back a little bit, so what you described earlier about when you came back home and the approaches you took getting the letters of intent.
Right.
So you obviously did, what we would call, I guess, immersion research, right? You push yourself in the shoes of a person and try to figure out what they need.
Right.
But it must have been challenging, right? I'm sure when you went around, there weren't, I guess, were there tons of yeses? Were there some pushback? People didn't quite understand, didn't quite, think that there would be something that would be valuable, you think?
So I probably hit, I think it was 32 businesses in different sectors. So banking, insurance, legal, and somebody else we had, right? We knew we wanted to go to the financial services market, which we felt created the most confidential information and also would have had the greatest need. So I go to those guys, go to their operations managers, talk to them, and they were like, yeah, man, this is great. And then when they told me what they were doing, they're like, oh yeah, this would be good to get into. And certainly when it came, we would go with it. And so I got all these letters of intent. I took them into the bank to say, hey, listen, there's a market. So let's say there's 32. So bank extends me the loan. I place the order. We get the trucks. We get the equipment. I drive everything down. I'm here. I set up shop. And I'm like, hey, listen, 32 people. Hey, listen, I'm in town. I'm ready to start business, right? And they look at me. And out of the 32, I had 3 that took us right away. Right? So 3 out of the 32. The other 32 probably took 2 to 3 years before they came on board. But, you have to kind of look at that and say, you know what? Everybody thinks it's a good idea. Some of them weren't ready to commit at that time. Some people kind of moved, particularly in the financial services sector. You had a number of people who were moving and jumping from one company to the next, to the next, to the next, right? And so the person who I might have dealt with when I first came was not there when I came back, right? But, I look at them as all of these were the lessons, and I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I got 3. We're going to start with 3.
Yeah, 10% conversion.
We're going to keep going. And it was just about, how do you keep knocking on doors, showcasing the service, demonstrating the benefits and to my clients or potential clients, and how do I convert them? And that's the biggest thing. How do you sell the product? How do you let them see the benefits? And then how do you provide a value proposition that they will execute on and commit to? And that started to happen. I mean, it didn't happen all instantaneous, but it started to happen. It was slow, but you go through your bumps. You go through your bumps.
So when you came over, you had your business plan, you had your collateral, you got the funding you wanted,
right?
And out of what but you expected only 10% of the revenue drivers were there.
Right.
How did you react upon, you came home to the Bahamas, you have your family, you did this.
Yeah.
How did you take those drops? Because that's not a 50% drop, that's a much larger drop in expectations. How do you emotionally handle that?
So when you're 28, you're naive, right? And so for me, I was borderline hyper confident and hyper cocky at the same time. And some things I just let brush off of me, right? Oh boy. Boy, I tell you, that back then, that was crazy.
He could see it.
Yeah, and it was rough, right? It was rough, particularly when you had people who were promising you X and you're expecting your cash flow to be this to meet the commitment back to your banks, back to your vendors, etc. You start getting desperate when the cash flow is not coming in, and then you start looking at alternatives. I'll give you a point in case. And this is something very, very critical for businesses or young entrepreneurs. When I came in, I said, okay, well, I'm going to start shredding, right? I saw in the States that people were shredding. In Canada, they were shredding, but also they had this byproduct of recycling. So everything that's shredded, they compact, they bale, and then they sell it. So it's another revenue stream. So I started getting all the stuff that I was shredding, and I said, okay, now I'm going to go into, not immediately, but soon thereafter, I wasn't getting the revenue. So I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to start to recycle, which meant now I had to go get a different place to store the paper, which meant I'm now paying more rent. I had to go and get equipment to compact and bale it, to prepare it, to ship it out. So I went and bought more equipment. And then I said, okay, well, no problem. I'm going to do this. And if I make some money from this, it'll help to defray some of my additional expenses. Anyways, I went and I did it. I got a broker, sold the paper, but here it was now. I expected to get X. And I sent out a few 40-foot containers worth of paper. Well, paper is a commodity that trades. So when the guy gave me the quote for what I should get to when the paper actually got out to what was sold, it tanked. I can tell you that my check was $13.67.
Versus what?
No, so when I sold all of the paper, so we sent out like three containers. When I sold all of the paper and the guy sent me back the check, it was a US dollar check for $13.67.
What was your expectations?
Yeah.
I was expecting at least almost 80 grand.
Oh my gosh. Oh my.
Right? For me, and that would have been a great buffer to pay back the banks and settle up and stay afloat. $13.67 did not pay for an hour to have two guys working the machines.
So that must have brought up some really immediate realizations in terms of your expectations on your forward earnings for that revenue line.
Right. So I immediately cut that out. I said,
you just bought all the equipment.
Yeah, I bought all the equipment. I left it there, and I'm like, you know what? This makes no sense because I'm fighting the market, and here I was shipping stuff from the Bahamas to a U.S. market, and by the time you take into factor all of the expenses and you can't predict I couldn't predict what the market was doing, would have done, and you can't fight it, right? If the market says that this is what we're paying per ton, and you're like, well, that ain't enough, right? So I was depending on a secondary source of revenue when I should have been focusing my efforts on my primary source of revenue, which should have been shredding.
Well, that's very, and one of our last podcasts, I think it's Robert Pantry who mentioned he doesn't like investing in businesses who have so many plan Bs. He wants to focus on someone who has the plan A, we're going to put all out into it. Yeah. And you're speaking about, hey, I kind of shifted from my focus and I didn't yield the results. I should have stick to my original focus.
So it's knowing when to jump into that next area. There's nothing wrong with having alternative sources of revenue, but it's just about knowing when to do it, and then if you're going to be dependent upon that source of revenue. So I got highly dependent upon that source of revenue when I should have been focusing on my primary. And it was just too early for me to step into that game. I should have waited until I got more mature, till my business kind of grew a little bit more. I should have waited until that stream had sufficient legs to stand on before jumping into something else.
What kind of time period are we talking? For when you started that, you bought all the equipment.
Yeah.
How much time did you accumulate 3 containers full, shipped it, and valued? Are we talking a month, 3 months, 4 months?
So that was about. It took me about 4 months to get to where we could send out the first shipment, because I ended up finding a building to store it. Then we had to outfit the building to prepare it for the equipment, and then you have to place the storage, and then I had to get the guys to come in and work it and do it, and so it took time to get there. So about 4 months, and then we were like, yeah, we're gonna, okay. And then I went and I did what I had to do, and then I get this check for $13. $13 could not pay for Kentucky, bro. I couldn't get us.
The reason why I asked that is because for our listeners to understand, you did a new revenue stream, and that's not a week of work.
No.
That's months of work, and it didn't work out.
That's
and
right.
So how do you, as an entrepreneur at that age, looking at it now, like, do you feel like, oh, I'm failed, or do you look at it like, okay, brush that off again, I'm moving forward? How do you look at that much time, and then that check? How does that? Are you motivated more to say, do this? What do you do next?
So definitely, so all of the above, right? So I'm like, damn, I failed at that, right? And you're like, geez, if I ain't getting the money from this, what I got to do, right? So you pivot back to what you know, and you focus on the key thing. So you feel all of those emotions of failure, and every entrepreneur goes through this. They should go through it, because you need that sting, you need that cut hip, so that you don't do it again the next time. It's that pain point that is a constant reminder of what not to do, right? And so you now focus on where you need to be. So that's what I did. I started focusing more on what I had to do, and I'm like, I got to keep going because I got too much invested, right? I got to keep going. I got my parents who done put up what they got to do for me. I got people looking at me. I got a young wife. I got to keep going, right? I done left Canada.
Yeah.
Right?
Six-figure
I done left Canada.
Six-figure job.
Right? Cashed out all of my a whole bunch of stuff. But I'm like, I'm in it. I gotta keep going. I knew that the business was still viable. So I'm like, let's go, let's press on. We're just gonna keep going through, find a different way.
Just to dig a bit deeper into that, because a lot of what people don't hear about entrepreneurs' story is what you're describing, the dark times.
Right.
But there must have been a moment, whether you were walking on a beach, sitting down in the house when everyone's asleep, and you're kind of just trying to figure out, like, Christian, is this the thing?
Right.
Did you ever have one of those moments that you would be willing to share to kind of give insight to?
This is easy. So I can tell you when it was, right? Remember I told you I got the loan from Bahamas Development Bank? Man, so this was me. This is crazy me, right? So back then when people used to send letters, right? I would get letters from everybody saying, you got to pay the bill, you got to pay the bill, you got to pay the bill, right? Something's due, something's due, something's due. And I let the letters just pile up because you see where it's coming from. You're like, man, they only can tell me the same story, right? One day, I pull up to my truck and there's a guy who had put a chain through the wheels of my truck and like chained it up to something. I'm like, who the hell tie up my truck, right? Like where I had it parked. I'm like, what's going on here? I go down to, I can't remember, some convenience store, buy a bull cutter, I cut the thing off. The guy sees me come back and cut the thing off. He's like, that's my chain. I said, this is my truck. He said, no, the truck belonged to Bahamas Development Bank. So I said, hold on, bro, what you here to do? Right? What you here to do? I mean, he couldn't tow it, right? It ain't like no car you could just pick up and tow, right? You're like, well, we come to repossess the truck. I say, yo, man, roll out of here before I don't clip you with something. So, so I'm sitting there, I'm like, oh man, so I gotta call Bahamas Development Bank and tell them X, Y, and Z, right? Because I hadn't been taking calls, I hadn't been responding to letters, right? And so by the time I called them, and I went down there, meet with the guy, the bank officer, and he's telling me like, Chris, bro, you ain't paid your bill you've missed on so-and-so. We had no choice. We had to come and repossess some stuff. I said, what? Then he tells me, he's like, man, we even sold the property for your dad that you had for collateral. I said, what? He said, yeah, here's the letters that we sent you, copies of the letters. These are the same letters I haven't even opened up, right?
Wow.
So I'm like, oh, man. So bra's like, well, what am I gonna do? So after I went from the bank, I remember this, I went to church and nobody was at church. My church didn't even open up on those days, but for some reason the church was open. And I sat there and I remember being in the pew. I remember saying a prayer. I remember crying. I felt embarrassed. I felt shame. And I'm like, how am I gonna tell my dad that I lost his property, right? I just remember it very, very vividly. And as I'm sitting there and I'm saying my prayers, I must have been there for about 45 minutes, maybe an hour. One of the elders came, walked in, sat on the pew, told him what was happening. He told me what to do, gave me some advice. I went back to the bank and we worked it out, right?
What was that advice, if you don't mind sharing?
So basically he told me, you know what, Chris, you've got to come up with a payment plan. You've got to find something that works for the bank to satisfy this and ask for an extension. So it was one of my first moments of saying, you know, you have to be held accountable, right? You have to now stand up and say, okay, you've got a problem. Let's try and find a way to figure this out. But you've got a good business. You just got to do some adjusting, but you got to satisfy the people that have lent you the money, right? And have that hard discussion. It was a hard discussion. And so that day I had hard discussions with the bank and I had a hard discussion with my dad, who obviously was not pleased, right? Rightfully so. I can't blame him, right? And so that went from that, but that was the turning point. And then I came home to my wife and I told her, and she's like, Chris, you gotta open up the letters. You gotta open up the letters. And that became the changing point, right? That really was the changing point there. And it's just, yeah, like I said, I was young, I was dumb, naive, but I was like, I gotta still push on. Did I feel like giving up? Yeah, that was a temporary feeling, but I'm like, now I really gotta prove myself, right? I really, really gotta prove myself. And I'm like, let's just keep rolling and just find ways. And it just, that was the turnaround point.
What kept you going? I know you considered leaving. You said a short-lived where you wanted to stop, but what do you feel kept you going? Was it just a natural, I don't want to fail, or is it the family dynamic? What really kept you saying, I'm not going to get a full-time job and just park myself there?
What kept me going was that I still had clients. I just knew I had to push more on acquiring new clients. What kept me going was I didn't want to fail. I literally didn't want to fail. I didn't feel as though I had reached the point of failure, right? I felt as though I made some mistakes, but I didn't feel as though, you know, failure is when, to me, is when there's no buyers and you're just, you know, like you're trying to sell snow to the Eskimo, right? Like there's no buyers, you can't sell it. That wasn't the case. What was the case was that, you know, I needed to find a different way. And I knew that there were still customers that were out there to be had. And I was just like, okay, Chris, you got to polish up on this. You got to present yourself differently. You got to find a different way of getting in front of the clients. And I did that. And we just kept going. And I think at the end of it, or the foundation, the root of it, the Lord just kept telling me to keep pressing on. All right? He didn't tell me it was time to pack up and just, you know, turn around. And I'll give you another story. Several months after that, I remember having a meeting with Mr. Peter Andrews at Bahamas Waste Management. Peter Andrews at the time was the chairman, was the chief. I went in and I spoke to him. I got no idea how I ended up with him, but anyways, we were talking, and Peter's like, hey, listen, man, I could buy this business off of you, right? and man, you could work for me, and da 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 da, boom, boom, boom. I was like, man, that sounds good. I was like, all right, you know, and so I left there saying, hold on, if Peter Andrews could find a way to turn this business around and make X out of it, I could do the same. I later saw Peter maybe a year after that. I didn't sell, right? I didn't sell. I said, if Peter could find a way to do it, I could find a way to do it. And I remember going back to him about a year afterwards. And I told him, I said, man, Peter, you inspired me not to sell. He goes, that was the job, young man. I don't think he wanted to buy it, but I think he was just trying to give me a kick in the hip to say, hey, bro, you got to get up off your, and start doing some things differently. And it inspired me, it really inspired me. So I was just like, if they could tell me you could do it, and I could do it myself. I'm going to find a way.
That's interesting. One of the first episodes we did was with Ethan Moss.
Right.
And we talked about the myths of entrepreneurship. Right. And one of the myths, if I remember correctly, was that, entrepreneurs believe they have to do it all by themselves. And then another one was, I got to keep my secrets, my ideas to myself, because someone can take them. But what you just described was having the opportunity to meet with, I guess, a more seasoned entrepreneur at the time.
That's right.
Right. Who proposed buying your business, right? Which I think is probably one of the expectations that people have, that, someone's always wanted to try to take it away from me. Right. But he gave you advice, right? What I want to ask is, how did that not feel to you, but was it something that truly caused you to think that, I know you mentioned it, that it caused you to continue and press forward, but did it cause you to really consider letting it all go?
As a family man too, you have
I'm just thinking.
No. So I couldn't let it go, right? So I couldn't let it go because I still had responsibilities, right? I still had to provide. I was probably just married. So at the time when I got married at 28, I was married 2 years, and this was probably another 2 years in. So I hadn't even been married like 5 years, and I was just experiencing failures, right? So I still got a young wife, right? Young and sexy wife, right? And I'm like, I can't let her down. I had a vision of where I wanted, of the kind of life I wanted for myself. I had seen what this business in another country looked like and the success people have had. And I was like, nah, we still got to press forward. What I did to kind of change it around was I then took some of the same cues that I had in my previous business. So when I worked in Canada, I worked in IT, but 60% of my job was research and development for the brokerage firm. But what we would do is we would go out to, our boss at the time would send us out to conferences and say, hey, listen, you guys go and find the best product for database management, find the best products for this, find the best product, bring it back in-house and evaluate it. So I said, you know what? I learned a lot by just going to conferences. So I'm like, there must be a conference in this industry. So I then joined the association, well, at the time it was called National Association for Information Destruction. It was based in the States, but it was everybody who was in that industry used to go there. So I was like, I'm gonna join that association so that I can increase my knowledge base of the industry, so that I can get some more exposure, so I can network with other business owners, so that I can see what other people were doing, and I could lean on their expertise, their experience, and whatnot. And I said, help me to grow, not just as a business owner, but more specific, grow as a successful business owner in this industry. And so I joined that association, and that was one of the critical factors for my knowledge and exposure just going up like this. And I started to attend seminars, attend conferences, and I took lessons that I learned, pieces, and I brought it to how I could apply it to my situation. That helped my business to just start to go in a totally different direction.
I do have a question that carries it back a little further.
Yeah.
Off camera, we are talking about what society was like before Sunryse when it came to the destruction of their correspondence.
Right.
And so for our listener, they may not understand how critical this is, but if you're open to financial services,
Right.
I would like you to speak about what it was before Sunryse shredding. How were
What were
banks,
people doing?
commercial, offshore banks, insurances, how were they disposing of critical data, privy information?
Right.
What was happening?
So first I told you we did some market research of what people were doing, right? And they gave me the clean version. So most of those companies in those industries that I went to, they were saying, they would do their own shredding in-house, and they would have, masses of stuff kind of build up, and they would get people to kind of shred and stuff like that. Their own little shredding machines, and sometimes the machines would break and stuff like that. So I'm like, all right, that was a clean version. All right, I'm like, if you getting a machine, I could come and bring you a better machine. If you got people who are doing it that you're paying for it, well, you could just outsource me for a cheaper cost. So I'm like, I could reduce your labor costs, I could reduce your equipment costs, whatnot. That was a clean version. When I started to get into it, I remember one of my clients, they weren't a client at the time, but I had an occasion that when we had the paper and we were bringing the paper back, at the time we were trying to compact it and bale it and stuff like that. And I would have boxes and I would take it out to the dump. All these cardboard boxes. I got a big truck and I had, 1 or 2 employees and my nephew. Anyways, we went out one day out to the city dump. Go to the city dump and I see this mountain of white stuff. It looked like snow. If you don't know what the city dump used to have and still probably does, the big old tractors that go there and they level out the ground, they dump the stuff and then they level it out and they bury it, they put fill on it and they bury it, right? Well, I go there one day and everything has been leveled out and there's this mound of white stuff that looked like something dropped. So I'm like, man, I'm gonna pull the truck up there, let me see what this is. Sure enough, these are this is a bank's, this was a commercial bank's bank records. And if you don't know, banks used to print on these continuous form, they look like, I used to call them, they're like this, and these are big form, big ledgers and stuff like that. I'm like, well, what is all of this? I open it up, I look at it, I see it's a particular bank. I look at it and I see the records. It has other businesses that they deal with and the transactions that they deal with. And I look at the date and I'm like, wow, this is kind of recent. This was like 4 months old. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is very recent stuff. But I'm like, these are people's clients' information that is out there. And I said, I wonder if they knew about this. So anyways, I load all the stuff back into my truck. I go home.
So you take the stuff from the dump.
I took the stuff from the dump and put it in my truck. Because if you don't know, the city dump used to have a whole bunch of people who were around there scavenging for different things and whatnot. So I'm like, if somebody got this, they could take that information and cast it out into the public. I'm like, I didn't want that. And I'm in a business, right? So I'm like, all right. Anyways, put everything. I said, guys, y'all load up the truck. Got it. Took it home, made some calls to some people. I'm like, you know anybody at this bank that I could talk to? I need somebody senior up. So we made a call. It was the VP of the bank. I told her what was going on. She's like, no, that can't be. That was stuff that's 20 years old. It's past its retention period, da-da-da-da. I said, no, miss, this is stuff that's 4 months old. She's like, what? I said, miss, I'll bring the stuff to you to show you. I said, this is the business that I'm in. I'm into shredding the documents. But I said, I'm gonna bring the stuff to you and you tell me what you wanna do with it because it's your business. And literally, I drove up there that evening. When she saw it, her mouth dropped. I said, miss, here are the records. And these were her clients' deposits, bank balances, transactions of their activities. And I mean, very, very sensitive information. So right then, we entered into an agreement the following day and we had them for quite a while, right? But people used to just dump their stuff. They would burn their stuff. They would try and bury their stuff. They just did not have efficient ways of securely destroying this information. And I was just like, okay, here you go. That was a point in case, and that led to a customer. And that things like that kind of started to change different things.
Did you go to the dump more often and take stuff?
Yeah, second time, third time.
We sent people to the dump. At that point, I started to, truth be told, I was like, hey, listen, y'all out there, this is my number. And I was like, anybody find anybody else sending paper out to the dump? Y'all give me a call and I can give you all something when I get up there. So I didn't have to go back. Well, I went back a few times because I got some calls, but I didn't go every day. But the people who are out there, they're regulars, and they were like, yo, Mrs. Sawyer, Mrs. Sawyer. I was like, yeah, okay, leave it right there.
So, I mean, what you just described, is pretty interesting and obviously a hell of a story, but it speaks to opportunity.
Yes.
Right? In the moment, it speaks to instinct, right? Because not everyone would have thought to take the paper from the dump. Some people would have just decided to, get a number and say, I saw, but then they don't have the proof. But you kind of thought it through well enough where you understood what the opportunity was.
Right.
You understood either intentionally or unintentionally the leverage of having the information to show proof. Yeah. And then it was like the perfect commercial, right? The phone call and the offer, So,
well, at that time, I couldn't tell anybody how I got that story, right? As for the client. And I mean, we took pictures of everything. I got the pictures now, right? Yeah. But, at that time, definitely was about seizing the opportunity. And I had other things like that. And what you'd find is somebody would say, hey, listen, man, I got a guy who could get rid of these documents for you. And next thing you know, you see this truck driving down. I can tell you I had another story. Guy was driving down Airport Road. And all of the bank stuff was on the back of the truck, and all the paper was going in the back of the truck. He flying down the road. And the paper's just going on. But the fella, he don't care, because he don't view that as anything. He's just like, that's paper. But these were people's very, very critical information. And I'm like, from a risk and compliance perspective, clients would not have appreciated that. And so I could tell you, I was on the highway. I picked up paper off of the highway. I might have been the boss, but I'm like, I'm going to pick this up, get it, put it in the back of my car, and then I'm going to give these guys a call. And that's how I kind of got clients. That was part of the way. It was just seizing the opportunity.
Yeah, definitely.
So there's a level of fearlessness that's there as well. I'm going to take certain chances. When you're looking at entrepreneurs in general, what advice do you give startup companies who are in the mud, they're struggling? Should they be fearless? Should they take these risks? What advice would you give them to measure and balance that?
Yeah, you have to be fearless, but I think the other part too is, here's the big thing. I'm going to say this in this social media context right now, right? For young entrepreneurs. Never get hung up on title, right? Like, I'm a boss, I'm an entrepreneur. Good thing to say, but titles can be heavy, right? So, and when titles get heavy, your ego tells you that because you're a boss, you can't do X. When you own your own business, you have to be able to do every single thing. So for me, I had no problem driving the truck. As a matter of fact, I wanted to drive the truck so that I could teach my drivers what to do. I wanted to shred so I could teach them the proper way to go through the process. I wanted to do everything. I had to do everything because I'm bringing people on to train them on what not to do. And I never felt as though my title entitled me for something that I should not do, right? And so if I had to pick up paper off of the dump and load my truck so that I could get a client that would last 15, almost 20 years, yeah, I'm going to do that. I've heard, I got some family and they're like, no, man, I ain't doing that, man. I ain't doing that. No, bro, if you got to clean the toilet, you clean the toilet. If you got to prep for this, you got to prep for that. You got to do it, right? Like, that's what you got to do. You got to do the grunt work. So don't let the title get in your head that you shouldn't be doing something. But be fearless and release everything else and say, man, I got to do what it takes to get paid, to bring on a customer so that I can have bread for the next day and the next week, and I can pay my staff. And if that's what's required, you do it.
So it's crazy. You're talking about doing the things that matter, right?
Yeah.
And you did that and made your way to the topic of this episode, and
Sure.
8-figure valuation.
Sure.
So how important is the daily grind, right, versus the titles that you're talking about, right? Like, how do you, how easy was it or difficult was it for you to focus on the day-to-day grind versus the 8-figure valuation? And was that even a thing?
No. So bear in mind, I got 20 years in my business, right? So let's do it in 5-year chunks or 7-year chunks, right? These were all different things, and I was focusing at different stages of the business. I was focusing on different things. And let's call the first 5 to 7 years, I was just trying to perfect my craft, right? Trying to hone the business, understand the business, and get it running to a point, right? That's the first 7 years. So the daily grind was there, right? And then we grew from one truck to a second truck, and we just started to go like that. So that daily grind helps you to understand what needs to be done in each aspect of the business. And then it helps you now to look and say, well, you know, what's my driver, my revenue driver? And that's the thing that I need to focus on. So as I start to focus on creating revenue, generating revenue, all of these other things, I need to find people to do the other sets of work. So my daily grind became different as the business grew in different phases. And mind you now, I just had a different grind at each one of the phases of the business, right? But that daily grind, being systematic, being disciplined, keeping your eye focused on what's the biggest goal, what's the goal that drives the company. Oh yeah, that's incredibly important.
And how comfortable were you with relinquishing that sort of first phase daily grind? And what I'm speaking specifically to is, you know, you started the business,
Yeah.
right? You and your wife, and you were a part of the day-to-day. And at some point, whether that's midpoint of phase 1 to phase 2, you have to now start to relinquish your daily involvement in the business and trust other people to maintain the same standards as you. Was that something that you found to be easy? Did you kind of prepare yourself for it mentally? How did you handle that phase?
I was ready for it. I was like, it's there's some things I just wasn't good at, right? I just, you know, I was never the best person, let's say, for example, in HR. I'm the worst person to give an interview and to hire people. Like that, I'm the worst person to conduct an interview, right? Because everybody I like, right? You smile, that sounds good. You know, oh yeah, man, and you tell me you're gonna do this for me? Oh yeah.
That's the one.
That's the one. I can hire that one, right? I'm the worst person to be conducting those interviews, right? And hiring people. So I was happy to give those things up, right? Because I made the worst selections, right? It wasn't my strength. My strength was in sales, my strength was in operations. And so everything else under that, somebody else could deal with it. Back office, accounting, receivables, all of that stuff. Y'all go do all of that. And then, you know, even with the operations, HR training, that somebody else could do with that. I had no issues as long as they were meeting the standards in which we outlined. I'm like, go run with it.
How did you know you weren't good at it? So you hired some persons, they didn't work out. Did you make excuses at first and say, maybe they didn't work out because of this, maybe because it didn't work out because of that? How did you learn, this is not my strong point?
Man, so I hired one of my friends, man. Man, he's an old high school friend, boom, boom, bang, bang, you know. Man, I think I'd known the guy from like preschool. Anyways, next thing I know, this guy is out there on the job, but then he's passing around him fake banknotes, counterfeit money, right? Like I'm like, oh man. And I brought him in the company to say, okay, you know what? I'm gonna help my friend out, and man, I was the worst, right? It was the worst. I didn't do any background checks. I didn't do none of that, and I was like, oh, just absolute worst. So I knew when I made the mistake, right? I was like, that's just not the right person. And then I also knew when I was hiring people and I kept them on for too long, because I'm like, oh Lord.
Hiring them and keeping them on too long.
Yeah, bro. See, once again, I'm a softie. So I'm like, all right, that's my boy. Homegirl is doing her job, but she's doing it like 60% good. the other 40%, I got to fight with her. She coming in late, this and that. And I ain't want to fire her because, well, for whatever reasons, she got a kid, it's this and that, all kinds of stuff. I'd find all kind of things. Oh, that ain't the right Christian thing to do. Oh, that's so-and-so family, all kind of stuff, right? They're too long. I didn't fight, the old adage, hire long and fire quick. No, I was all the reverse. And then I saw that they were now being, they were messing up the morale of the other team, right? Because they weren't living to the right standards, and the team was coming down, and you got to go. So you got to go.
To entrepreneurs right now who's building up a team
Right.
or dealing with a team, and they're like, I wish I never put this team together. I wish I could start from scratch.
Right.
What's your advice on handling staff? Is it, as a leader, is it just, hey, rip the Band-Aid off and move forward? Just don't get so caught up in the emotions. So what's the advice you would give to someone navigating the business, building and having staff?
Okay, so it depends where you're at and the maturity you're at in your business, right? So I got two things for that. I watched the show one time, and I couldn't remember the name of the show right now, right? And this guy, he had a team. He ended up firing everybody on his team except for one person, because he had to start brand new. If you know that your team is it's just not the best team, yeah, you got to get rid of the old team and start new. And that people be like, man, that's kind of tough, da-da-da-da-da-da. I ain't saying to fire all of them one time, phase them out. Some apples, I remember, this is another head of a bank told me this. He said, Chris, he was at my church. He said, I have a list. I won't call the name. He said, I got a list of the 10 people in my organization that I need to fire right now. They are not A players. They are C players. And I can't get rid of them yet. I said, what? He goes, yeah. He goes, but don't worry, in the next 6 months, we can get rid of them. I started learning that it's okay to get rid of the C and D players and have B plus players and A plus players and A players, so that you can build a B plus to an A. And you want to have, I started learning that you need to have 90% of your company needs to be B plus moving to A players, right? It's a tough position to be in. And sometimes you just need to move one person. Sometimes you find that one person, that's the grouchiest person on the team. They bring down the whole spirit of the team. They always complaining, they coming in late, da-da-da-da. You need to get rid of that one. When you get rid of that one, everybody else fall in line.
I think the story you were talking about, there's a book actually that talks about this. The book is called BYOB, Build Your Own Business, by Brian Scudamore.
Sure.
He is the founder of 1-800-GOT-JUNK. They do about 500 million plus a year, based out of Canada. And he started a junk removal business. And the initial name of the business was called the Rubbish Boys. And he got to the point that you just described. He had to clean house, fire everybody but himself. And then he started over again, trying to build the business with the right people who had the same values and expectations, had the same mission, I guess, so to speak. I guess the question I want to ask too is, and as we probably transition more towards, how we got up to the valuation of the business and getting ready to sell, is what value did you place on that particular phase of the business when you identify that you have team members that aren't fitting the bill and you have to get rid of them?
So let me go back to your point, right? Here's something that I would say. A lady told me and my wife at one of the conferences, she says, hire the people that you deserve now, right? Hire them that you deserve now. There were some people I wanted to have in my company. I just wasn't making enough to pay them at that time. And she goes, hire them now, build them to the point so that you can get the revenue, so that at some point you could really hire the people that you really want in your company, who are going to move your company forward, who are going to move the needle in your company. And that kind of stuck with us, was that, you know what, and we knew that we had different people for each phase. Not everybody is going to go along with you for the ride, right? So, you know, you had some people for a certain phase, and then, you know, naturally they will transition out. We started to implement, in particular, our core values. We didn't do that early on, but when we implemented our core values and started, you know, it was unwritten, but then when we wrote them down, it became very, very real, and we knew how to hire and fire based on core values. And then when we set the tone in the whole company, one thing you would have had, if you came to our property or our offices, we had the core values posted everywhere. They were posted in the kitchen, they were posted in the bathrooms, they were posted in the conference rooms, they were everywhere. And we had our staff memorize those core values, so they understood what the company stood for. And that helped to keep and maintain company standards, and we kept good employees, right? So it was a part of the process. You know, as we moved into different phases, it just became part of the process. We really started focusing on not just maintaining good employees. A lot of people talk about maintaining good customer service, but you got an internal customer, which is your employees that you need to work with. And we started doing a lot of work with our employees and moving them and transitioning them from B to B pluses to A performances, and coaching and training them to get to that point. We started really taking a look at what leadership meant versus management. A lot of people will say, you know what, Chris, you know, you got a management team. I never liked management team. I never liked that word management. We had a leadership team. I wanted leaders to produce leaders. I didn't want managers to create to manage individuals. Management meant parents and children. You manage your children. No. If I gotta manage you to like be on time, this ain't the right person. This ain't for you. I don't want to have to manage you straight. I want a leader to lead and create other leaders in our team. And I'll tell anybody this: if you want a really good book on how to create leaders in your team, there's a book called Extreme Leadership by Jocko Willenick. These are U.S. Marines that talked about what leadership is. So if you look at your business and you look at any type of armed forces, they don't have managers. They got leaders. Because at any point, you could have a lieutenant take out a platoon of guys. The lieutenant gets shot on the battlefield. The next in line got to step up, right? So you would have had to train that leader to step into that leadership role right then, right in an instant. Managers only manage people, and they can't step up because they're so used and dependent upon being managed, right? People providing the answers for them, and that's a different perspective. No, I wanted leaders to produce leaders.
That's a very powerful point.
That book changed the dynamic of how I looked at teams. It's a very good book. I mean, and then I'll tell you this, you know, my leadership team. So in the second and third phase of the business, we started doing things differently, and I started going on a different trajectory. But this is what I found had happened. This was me as the leader, and this was the rest of my team, and I was going like this. So as I was going like this, my team was moving like this. The rest of my team, my leadership team, were like this. And I was like, I'm way out here. I'm way down the corner, way down the road. And my team's still here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've gone too far. And they can't understand where I'm at, right? And so I was like, I got to bring them along. And John Maxwell said something about the law of the lid, right? The law of the lid says that your team, your company will only go as far as where you are as a leader, right? That lid is there. So, but even if I'm here and everybody's down here, it's too far of a gap. I need to have everybody on the same page, understanding what I'm doing. And so one of the things that I started doing was I implemented for my leadership team was that we're going to start to read a book. What I'm reading, you're going to read. So you could understand why my position is the way how it is, because I might not be able to explain it. So what we started to do, my leadership team had a weekly meeting. We would go over the numbers, do all of the KPIs, all of that stuff. But then you had to read a chapter or two, and we had to discuss that in the leadership meeting. So after we done dealt with all of the business of the company, now we're going to talk about your personal development. And we all read books and talked about those books, each one of those chapters, every week. And we did that for like 6-7 years. And we had to read. You have to read. Ain't no excuse. And I knew when a team member did not read, because you had to give input on those chapters. And so if you really want to grow, you got to read. You got to read. Like let's become learners. And as we became learners, I mean, that was one of the things. But as we started to learn different principles, we got on the same page. And then how do we implement what we have learned? The whole team started to do better. And the gap started to close, and all the tides rise. And then they started putting it down to their teams. So teams are important, bro. Teams are important.
When you started the business with your wife,
I started the business on my own, and then I offered my wife a job, right? Working with your wife and a young wife ain't easy.
Careful now.
Ain't easy. But out of the 21 years of business, my wife worked with me for about 19 of those years. But when I brought my wife on, it's a funny story. I created a job description for her, and I had to present that with benefits, right? As a regular company would, right? And she had to look at it, review it, and we went into a negotiation on that. And so I didn't want her to feel as though she's coming into the business and she's going to be working for me. It was like we're working together on this. And so we worked in partnership 19 out of 21 years.
what would your advice be to other, especially during COVID? I watched partnerships and couples who owns business together crumble. And what's the advice to persons who want to start a business and work along with friends or work along with their significant others?
Right.
What's your advice to navigating those waters?
Wow, that's a very broad question, because the dynamics are different. If you work with your spouse, so recognize where you got to go. When you go to work, work is work. When you come home, that's your home. You have to, you better know your wife too. You better know your wife, you better know your spouse, your husband, and know the temperaments, because there's a lot that needs to take place. So I respected my wife based on her professional opinions on what she would give me because of her past experience, right? In her own professional capacity. And so I respected her right off the bat, right? And she wasn't there to serve me, she was there to serve the business. And even though we had opposing views at times, and we would butt heads, but we would always be like, what's in the best interest of the business? And that can extend now to, partnership with friends, with families. They have to work in unison to be in what's best for the business. What's the guy's name? Dr. Phil. Dr. Phil McGraw gave some good advice. He says, it's not about somebody coming up with the best idea, right? Because in your mind, you may think it's the best idea, but you got to find a best idea that works for both parties. So what's the best idea? What's the best thing for the business and not for yourself personally? Because sometimes we could get particular men or anybody who's just hyper-driven, they want to be right, right? So it ain't so much about what's right for me, but what's right for the business. And that's what I would tell it about, partnerships. And sometimes you gotta just drop back on that ego. My grandfather always says, you know what? There's one thing about being right, and there's another thing about being dead right. And there's a lot of people who have been dead right, and they are dead. Yeah, they won the battle, but they lost the war.
That's a great point.
Right?
So I want to kind of shift. I know we're getting to the latter part, but when it comes to when did you consider the business successful? You have a lot of entrepreneurs who, they as soon as they start, they want to be a success. Or when it gets hard, they leave if it's not successful. When did you say, you know what, this business is successful?
So I guess success for me was defined at various phases. So I considered it, like in my first phase, I was like, yeah, this is a success because people are biting.
You got the
right?
clients, man.
Right there, like we're getting them to buy the product. And I'm like, yeah, like they're finally getting it. So that was a measure of success for me. Then the next was, wow, how can we go from one product offering or one service offering to another, and then to another, and then to another. And I was like, man, that's another success. I'm able to meet the needs, solve the problems that my clients are having. And that was another measure of success for me. So at different stages, I had different indicators of what success meant to me along the line. I mean, I'll tell you that even though we have sold the business, the other measure of success that I get now is I have former staff members that have gone on to other companies, and then they come back. Like just yesterday, I was in the airport, one of my former employees came and they were like, Chris, Mr. Sawyer, boom, 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 I'm so thankful. Or they meet my wife and they're like, I'm so thankful for the lessons that you taught me because I moved, what I learned with Sunryse, I've implemented them over here. And I've gotten, my wife just told me a story, and she's like, the team member, she's now gotten 2 or 3 promotions to where she is now. And she attributed a lot of that to what she learned with us at Sunryse. And so that was another measure of success for me. You have others. I mean, my personal measure of success for me in business was not about the amount of money I had. I did not want profit is a measurement of success in the business, but it's not the only thing. So for me personally, it was time. Remember I told you before I moved here, I was living in Toronto. I met a guy, his name is Michael Lee Chin. Michael Lee Chin is a black Jamaican billionaire. Yeah, the Michael Lee Chin. Oh, absolutely, right? And I met him when I was in my early 20s, me and a group of friends. And anyways, he sat us in a room, and this is one of our financial advisors who said, you guys come meet this guy who runs this business. I didn't know it was called Berkshire, so I didn't know whatever. It's like, all right, cool, we're investing with him. All right, gotcha. I ended up meeting the guy, and he's like, he sat us down. He's like, what's success? What do you guys want? And everybody was like, we want financial freedom. We want financial freedom. We want financial freedom. And because that was the buzzword back in the 90s. So financial freedom. And it's like, all right, well, how much money is financial freedom to you? So everybody's like, $1 million, $2 million, right? And I'm like, yeah, $2 million. And I'm in my early 20s, 2021. Man, if I had $2 million, I would have been like a billionaire at the time, right? But this was years ago. And he looks at me and he looks at all of us and he sat in the room and he's like, nah. He goes, let me tell you something more powerful than money or the freedom of financial freedom. He goes, I want you guys to aspire for freedom of time. And he goes, financial freedom will be the byproduct of freedom of time. Because when you have time, that means your money's already coming in. But when you have time, you now have time to impact all the other areas of your life. And that stuck with me. I'm like, yeah, I want that freedom of time to be able to travel, to be able to sit there with my children when I need to and invest time with them. I remember Michael Dell giving a story. I was listening to Dell, and Dell was like, he worked like 65, 80 hours a week. He never saw his kids. And I was like, what is the profit of man to inherit all the money but to lose his soul, to not be able to spend time with his kids and da-da-da-da. And then Michael Dell shifted. He totally shifted that. And I was like, I don't want to be hundreds of millions of dollars. That's not what's important to me. Yeah, I want to have a good bank. Everybody wants to have that financial base. But what's more important? Let me spend some time with my wife. Let me spend some time with my kids. When my friends call me and they need whatever, and I could just jump on a plane, hit them up and say, hey, bro, we're here. Let's go pray. Let's go talk. Let's go do what we have to do. Somebody calls me for some community event, and I could fill in. I could do this, and all right, yeah, I got freedom of time, and to me, that became more important, or my biggest measurement of success. I had another thing, which was where me and my wife traveled, and I was like, the only way I could determine how successful my business really is how much time I could spend away from the business. So we started doing vacationing. I was like, I remember when we first started, we could only take a long weekend off, right? Then we could, we only get that one day. Then we could take a week or 2 weeks. And then, we reached a point in the business where I could take 4 weeks, 6 weeks off, and I would go to Europe, and I'm like, okay, here I am, I'm on a cruise, 4 weeks out. Okay, what's happening to my business? How strong am I? How strong of a team do I have, and I'm not there? It wasn't that I wasn't checking in. I would check in like maybe once every 2 days, once a week, whatever. But, if I'm not there, do I have a sufficient team to handle the day-to-day stuff? And you really want to see where your business is, remove that key person and see how long that business is there.
And was that the point, I guess, the 1 week or the 4 weeks, 6 weeks, was that the point where you guys knew you wanted to sell?
No. That was just about enjoying time and saying that we have the success where we don't necessarily have to be tied to the business every day. Getting to the point of where we sold, so I think I was already, let's look at the last 7 to 8 years of the business. I really started to focus on building a business to sell it. Now,
Intentionally? You were intentionally making decisions in those 7 years with the goal of, were you inadvertently doing that?
no, I was intentional about, I'm going to build this business to sell it. Because in my industry, that's what a lot of businesses did. In the States, they would build a business, bring it up to sell it, right? Now, mind you now, I'm like, this is the Bahamas, that's the US market, two totally different markets. But I'm still going to build this business to sell it, because the valuable lesson in building your business to sell it is not that you want to sell, right? But you're creating value in your business by making the business as efficient, as cost-effective, as profitable, streamline the processes to make it as valuable as possible if somebody were to come along. So if somebody were to come along and give you an offer and say, man, you see what you got there? I'm going to give you whatever figure is comfortable for you. Versus somebody saying, hey, listen, you know what? You got a real crappy business, and I'm going to give you not what you've put into the business, right? So it's really about, it ain't no different than somebody saying, how can I make this thing to be as valuable as possible, right? And if somebody does come along and give you the offer, then you could take the offer. Even if they don't take the offer, even if you're not willing to sell, you've already created all of the right systems, put the right people in place, you've executed properly, and you've got great cash flow. You got a good business. You could still step away and put somebody in charge of that. You don't have to sell it, but you could say, hey, listen, you know what? I tried eating chicken, man. I've been eating chicken for the last 20 years. I now want to eat fish. I got vegan, or whatever you want to go. But you'd be like, all right, you know what? I've already done this with my business. I could step away, still receive the profits from it, and I could step out of the business and do something else.
So either way, you'd be good.
Absolutely, because you've created value in the business. But for me, my mindset was build a business to sell it. I didn't intend on selling it, but I was like, create a good value for it.
So when you talk about it's your baby, you thought about this before you even got back to the country.
Right.
Built it up 20 plus years. there are a lot of entrepreneurs who've had long-standing businesses and they're never going to leave that. They don't want to leave it. Their ego is attached to it.
Sure.
How did you separate that and say, you know what, at the end of the day, it's a business and I'm ready to move? Well, how did you go through that? Was that a difficult process to get your mind to say, I actually am willing to sign this document? I'm willing to bring it to the board. I'm willing to entertain offers. What type of emotional steps do you take in that to overcome?
So I was in a different position than a lot of people, right? So some people, they sell their business out of desperation because they've been in the business, they're 60 plus, they're 70 plus. They may not have any succession plans. They may not have a retirement plan or a retirement package, and they're kind of desperate to just get something to take them to the next phase in life. For me, it wasn't that way. It was emotional from the point where I would be like, yeah, this is something I built. This was a part of me. This was all that I put into it. And yeah, it wasn't easy, but it was something that I was mentally prepared to do. Because I looked at it very impartially and said, you know, is this a good deal? And then I looked at it from where I was. At the time when I sold it, I wasn't 50, right? And I'm like, I still got at least another 20 years left in me. I got gas in the tank. I'm ready to go another 2 or 3 laps. And I'm like, I can bet on me, right? And I'm like, all right, you know what? I could get some funds for this. That's cool. That'll do this, X. I could take some time out and I can start the next chapter of my life. So for me, life is about variety. Life was about not being pigeonholed. I'm not that guy to say, well, this is the only thing that I can do. And I'm like, I'm gonna bet on me that there's gonna be something else around the corner for me to do. There were other things that held my interest. And I was like, all right, you know what? I've reached that point. We've got some great success. Cool, we can step out. You know, and I looked at the business and I'm like, I've achieved, so this business, Sunryse, was the #1 in the entire Caribbean. There's no other business in the Caribbean, in our industry, whether it's in Barbados, Cayman, and whatnot, that was the size that we were and had the same product offerings. In Trinidad, Jamaica, there was nobody that could rival me. And we could rival anybody in the States. We were preparing to go into the US and start a different thing there, right? And we were gonna, you know, just acquire some other businesses. But when I said, okay, well, hey, listen, you know what? In the Caribbean, we're #1. People were looking at us. And I'm like, all right, you know what? It's good to tap out now. It's a good time. It's a good time to tap out and to start looking at phase 2, right? So everybody's at different positions of their life, so they're gonna make that decision a little differently. There'll be different factors, but that's what it was for me.
So thinking back to the beginning of when we started our discussion, you mentioned the most important inflection point in your business journey was being in the church, sitting in the pew, essentially literally having a come to Jesus moment.
Yeah.
And off camera, before we started, we were having a really good conversation about biblical principles. And you mentioned the book. Yeah. And I think it's important for you to mention the book and share, you know, maybe just 1 or 2 things from the book that sort of took you through your entire journey up to selling.
Oh man, that's a broad question, man. So my faith played an integral role in the decisions I made, right? My relationship with Christ, because he showed me this vision and he opened up doors and allowed people to speak into my life and allowed me to see different things. Certain books I read, one of the books I was referring to was Biblical Secrets of the Bible, read by Rabbi Lapin. I can't remember his name, but it spoke on retirement. And one of the key things I took out of that was that there's no thing as retirement in the Jewish community. It was just about, you know, how do you take what you've learned and now become not only a student, but now become a teacher? How do you take what you've learned and how do you put that into a different phase of your life, right? How do you now teach others, help them to grow, et cetera, et cetera? So those are some of the key things for me. And I was like, Chris, some people think retirement and then you're done and da-da-da-da. I wasn't near retirement, right? I wasn't even 50 at the time that I sold. And I'm like, most people get into retirement at like 65. And, we in the Western culture, we look forward to retirement at 65 and getting the package and all of that stuff. When I sold the business, I'd already been 20 years in my career. And I'm like, I could do something else. So there were just different things that were there. And I don't know if I answered your question, but that was just different for me.
Your second question?
And then the last question I probably would ask, not even ask, but just probably give you an opportunity, right? I think, as far as I know, you're one of the very few businesses that have sold for 8+ figures.
Sure.
You've done it in a country and in a market where it doesn't happen as often and as frequent as other jurisdictions. And so for the entrepreneur who is thinking about getting into a business, just leave them with a few words of encouragement and some advice.
Wow. Man, what I would tell anybody is continue to build your business, hone your craft, be the best that you have. Set some standards where it goes beyond your local market. So for me, my market was going to be here in the Bahamas, but the standards I had were not just for the local market, but it was for international standards. A lot of the banks I dealt with were international banks, right? And they would have auditors come down from Switzerland. They would order our services and everything and whatnot. They come from all around the world. And my thing was, how do I create a company that met international standards and that could compete on a global scale? And I felt as though, even though we didn't do that, we were well positioned to do that. And if we were to compare what we were doing here, and I noticed for sure, what we were doing here locally in the Bahamas and Nassau compared to other markets, whether it be Florida, you could take anywhere throughout the States, because I was able to compare. They weren't doing what we were doing. We were doing much higher. And that was illustrated by the company that bought us. We were their 106th acquisition, and we were the only international location that they bought. We were the only ones. I think still to this date, I don't think they have another person in the international market, but we were able to demonstrate to them that we could be a part of their network and show value to them. So for any young business owner, I would say, continue to get the exposure in the industry, continue to hone your craft, continue to be a ferocious learner, continue to partner with people, seek mentorship, and just really strive to knock it out of the park every time. Be happy at what you do, Yeah, be happy at what you do.
Chris, thank you so much for taking time to speak with us at Mastering Finance today. And to our audience, please follow us on our social media accounts, and we look forward to you tuning into our other episodes of Mastering Finance podcast. Thank you.